Chapter 14. The quartet of young people needed no lantern to light their way down the path to the lake. Bright moonlight reflected from the snow created a world of ghostly, sparkling white. Behind them, in the thick bush, trees cracked in the cold with a sound like gunfire, and they could feel the breath catch, freezing in their nostrils. There was no wind. The steady walking kept them comfortable inside their warm winter clothes. It was a good 2 miles across the lake to Joe Leake's shack, but after a day indoors, they all welcomed the exercise. "Suppose they'll still be up?" Jim asked. "It's about 8 o'clock. "Oh, sure," answered Ida. "The girl wanted that salt for supper, I expect. She's only an hour ahead of us." As they drew nearer, they made out the dark bulk of the log cabin in its rough clearing. "You can't see a light even if they got one," Ida volunteered. "There's moose hide over the only window, no glass." She took the lead as they climbed the bank and rapped with mittened knuckles on the door. There was a rustling noise inside like scurrying mice. Then a voice spoke in a sort of a grunt, and a moment later the door creaked open only a few inches. "Hello," said Ida cheerfully. "We come to wish you all a Merry Christmas and bring this for the little folks." Again the grunt from somewhere in the shack, and the door was pulled wider. It was the Eskimo woman, who stood there holding a dirty blanket about her, her dark figure etched against the light from a smoke-crusted oil lamp. She said nothing, but motioned for them to enter. Inside with the others, Jim looked about him, half fascinated, half disgusted. He had been in Indian houses before, and the thick reek of unwashed bodies was not new to him. The floor looked inches deep in filth, rags, moose hair, bones, all the accumulation trash of a place that had never been cleaned. A fire burned dully in a patch of earth at the far end of the hut, and the smoke eddied upward through a small hole in the roof. Jim nodded to Joe Leake, squatting on one of the bough beds that nearly filled the room. The dark faces of the children peered out from hiding places in the smoky gloom. Ida was putting the opening paper of candy in the squaw's hand. "Something to eat," she explained, pointing to her mouth in sign language. "See, you break it, like this." She picked up a bit of the brittle taffy and put it between the lips of the Eskimo. At the sweet taste, a light broke out over her face. She smiled, showed beautiful white teeth, and Jim remembered that Ida had described her as handsomer than most Indians. There was a kind of pride in the way she held herself, and the strange almond-shaped eyes had a look of mystery in their cold black depth. He could understand the superstition fear of the Ojibways who thought her a witch. "For you and the children," Ida finished, smiling and pointing. "Come on, kids, let's go along so they can enjoy it." Led by the silvery chime of Emil's bells, their dog sleds set out from Obing for town, the morning after Christmas. It was another clear, bright day, and the well-broken trail over the lake ice made a perfect going. Big Lindsay rode the trapper's sled, and sitting on a piled-up furs and wrapped warmly against the cold. Behind came Jim's team, augmented by one of Lindsay's huskies, and 3 dogs from Vanderbeck's home camp pulled the third toboggan. There were 6 people in the party. Miss Vanderbeck had no relish for the 70-mile round trip on snowshoes. She had sent them all off with her blessing, and said she'd be glad to stay at the cabin and keep the home fires burning. After their long evening of fun, they had slept late that morning. It was midday when they reached the long carry, nearing dark when they came out on Poplar Lake. They crossed to Lindsay's camp, and there, by dint of some crowding, made themselves comfortable for the night. It was a holiday trip. Hard beds and cramped quarters were part of the fun, and they took it all hilariously. An early start got them into Nakina at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. When the pelts had been unloaded at the storehouse, they took their duffel up to the track to their summer home. Then the boys and their father came back to greet various friends around the station. That night Mr. Vanderbeck made up an order of provisions and sent it off to the supply house in Port Arthur. A buyer from one of the great fur companies was expected in 3 days, and by the time the food arrived there would be money to pay for it. There would be good skiing on the long gravel hill to the west of town. Glad of the company of the boys of their own age, Jim and Lindsay spent most of the next 2 days sailing down the steep slope on their homemade skis. The evening of the 30th, the fur buyer got off the Limited, and word of his coming spread quickly from house to house. He established headquarters in the main room of the Little Frame Hotel. By daylight next morning, the trappers were assembled with their packs of fur. The buyer had a shrewd, gray-haired little Frenchman who had been in the business a long time. He spoke a half-dozen Indian dialects as well as English and French, and could spot a blemish in a carefully camouflaged pelt as far as he could see it. Big Lindsay sat listening to the first few sales, gossiping meanwhile with Emile, the Lagarde boys, and other acquaintances. "Prices are good," he announced at length. "I notice he's paying $11 for average mink, and that young Finn just got 80 for his silver fox. Ermine are only 50 cents, though." It was soon the Vanderbecks' turn. There was no haggling. Once or twice the boy's father called attention to a particular fine skin, and the price was raised $1 or two. In all, their early season catch brought $510. This included 11 mink, $120, 48 ermine, $24, 3 fisher, $165, 2 martin, $52, 6 fox, $72, 2 lynx, $40, 1 timber wolf for $25, and 1 coyote for $12. In addition, the boys had already gone to the warden and proved their claim to wolf bounties of $25 each. "Well done, boys," said Mr. Vanderbeck as he stuffed the roll of bills into his purse. "Do as well the rest of the winter, and I reckon we'll come through okay." The family stayed in town over the holiday and had their New Year's dinner at the home of a married sister. The following day, the freight from Port Arthur brought the supplies they had ordered. They spent the afternoon getting them home and repacking them on the toboggan. And before daylight on the morning of the 3rd, they were ready to start, hauling back to the bush. It was bitter cold as the two boys mushed down the track in the teeth of the wind. They beat their arms to keep the warm blood circulating and pulled the furred hoods around their face. The thermometer on the wall of the station stood at 43 below. They plodded down the long, white sweep of Cordonly Lake, where the stinging wind caught their breath and turned it to hoarfrost. When they got to the shelter of the woods along Cranberry River, the traveling was easier. "If it gets much colder," Jim panted through stiffened lips, "the dogs won't go." Lindsay nodded and plowed ahead. Half a mile further on he stopped, pointed a mittened hand towards the north bank. Jim saw a gray-black animal running on the edge of the woods, a silver fox. He fumbled with the deerskin case of his rifle, but before he could bring it into action, the fox was diving out of sight in the bush. "Too bad that one got away," he told his brother. "I saw the fur buyer give $70 or $80 for a silver fox. Why didn't you try a shot?" Lindsay patted the rifle under his arm. "Froze. Bolt action. Have to thaw it out." 2 deer crossed the ice ahead of them as they came out on Poplar Lake. Jim wondered again, as he often done, how such thin-legged, short-haired creatures could live through a winter in these bitter latitudes. The boys got to Lindsay's camp before dusk. With a big fire roaring in the stove, the cabin was soon warm. Meanwhile, while they unloaded the provisions and put the dogs in their kennels, the wind went down as darkness came, but the dry, still cold was unabating. In the morning they hitched up the teams and started back to Nakina. The dogs whined in the cruel chill of dawn. Several times on the trip to town they lay down in their harnesses and refused to move. On Jim's sled there was a whip which he rarely used, a homemade affair with a wooden short stick and a 15-foot rawhide lash. Grimly he uncoiled it now and stood over the dogs. They couldn't stay there and freeze to death. "Hup, you!" he shouted, and laid into their furry backs with a stinging crack of rawhide. Bruno got to his feet reluctantly, and the others followed. When they reached the head of Courtney Lake and hit the overland trail to the settlement, there was no more lagging. The dogs knew that they were nearing home and wanted to run. Jim and Lindsay came whooping into the dooryard, riding the sleds and both teams going at a full gallop. The temperature continued to fall that night. For the next 3 days it hung in the neighborhood of 50 below, and there was no use trying to haul supplies. Jim hiked down to the track for the mail, but was glad to get inside the snug log cabin. It was the 6th of January before the weather moderated enough to travel. That day, Jim and his father took another load to Poplar Lake, and on the 7th, Big Lindsay went on to Waba while the boys returned to town. There was a day's delay there, for a parcel of clothing had come in from the mail-order house, but on the morning of the 9th, Jim and Lindsay set out for their trapping grounds with the final load of supplies. The girls kept 2 of the dogs and stayed on in Nikina, waiting for one last package to arrive. Jim was glad, as always, to get back into the bush. "Funny, isn't it?" he said to Lindsay that night in the cabin on Poplar Lake. "I was crazy to get to town after Christmas. Seemed like the sweetest sound I could hear would be the old limited whistling up the track. Right now, I'd rather hear a wolf howl or a fox bark than all the Injuns on the CNR." They struck east to Wapping next morning and made such good time that they came out of the woods at the head of the lake by noon. A half-mile away on the northern shore, smoke was rising from a cabin half hidden by spruces. "Dad's line camp," said Lindsay. "Somebody's there. Let's go on over." A tall, familiar figure came out on the ice as they approached and threw up an arm in greeting. "Thought you boys might be along today," said their father. "I was getting ready to pull a net. Bait's running low with all these pet critters your ma's been feeding." "You leave it to us," Jim replied. "That's too heavy of a job for an individual to tackle alone. Come on, Lindsay, bring your axe and we'll get Dad some fish." It was a long task, for one of the holes had to be made wide enough to pull the net through, and they went down a good 3 feet before striking water. When both openings were chopped out, Jim pulled one pole up from the mud, untied the net, and made it fast to a long rope, the other end of which was tied to the pole lay flat on the ice. Then both boys went to the opposite stake and pulled it up. Hand over hand they hauled the net out on the ice, while the slack of the rope followed it beneath the surface. Caught in the mesh was nearly 30 fish. Suckers, whitefish, bullheads, and 4 huge pike made a glistening heap on the snow. When the net had been straightened out, Jim went back to the other end and hauled the rope back. The end of the net was then tied to its stake once more. Both poles were firmly thrust into the lake bottom. In half an hour the ice would freeze around them and they'd be fast again. They stopped at the cabin to warm themselves and brew a pot of tea. Then, with the fish on Big Lindsay's sled, they mushed their dog teams down the lake to the family's main camp.